It was like the risk, what it felt like was killing a part of myself. Because that's really what founders are doing. Like a company, you are putting yourself into the company and you identify with it. It's like a child in a lot of ways. And you don't want to kill your child. It's like a traumatizing experience.
Yeah. Hey guys, I'm Alex Yang, and this is the How I Decided podcast, a show where regular people share important decisions they've made so that we can make better decisions in our own lives and also figure out what we want from our lives and how we want to live our 20s. And if you're new to the How I Decided podcast, please subscribe to my YouTube channel, follow us on Spotify, and also on Instagram so that you can stay up to date on the newest episodes and spread the word about the importance of decision making in our 20s. My guest today is Josh Shapiro. Josh Shapiro was the co-founder of an education and tech startup called Edgi Learning, where he spent more than 2.5 years dedicating his time to his startup before shutting down in 2023. For the decision of shutting down your startup, it's a really tricky situation because founders are constantly told to not give up and be persistent, yet shutting down your company can sometimes be the right decision. So how do you know whether you're persevering in the right way or ignoring the signs that you should be actually shutting down your company? In this conversation, Josh and I explore this fine line and also discuss the importance of forgiving ourselves and how to separate your own personal mission from your company. Now, on to today's show with Josh Shapiro, coming from Brooklyn, New York. Well, thank you, Josh, for being on the How I Decide podcast. As you can tell, this is not where I filmed our last podcast. This is actually Josh's apartment in Dumbo, Brooklyn. So thank you for letting me use your space for this. So Josh and I met through Edgi Learning, the startup that Josh.
That's not how we met.
Oh, no, yeah, through.
Well, in my class.
I first heard about you through
Through
Edgi. But yeah, I took a class with Josh, who's an adjunct professor at NYU, and then interned with him at Edgi Learning over the summer, where I also met Ashe, who I've had on this podcast as well. He was episode 2. So yeah, the same startup, but a bit of a different decision that we'll talk about today. But I think I just want to first start by setting the stage for the listeners without getting into too much detail about all the things we did and tried with the startup. I guess maybe around 6 months before you actually shut down Edgi Learning, how was the company?
6 months before we decided to shut it down, it was probably doing better than it ever had, actually. I had a TikTok that went viral shortly after ChatGPT came out. The last pivot of the startup was basically building a chatbot, basically a wrapper around ChatGPT, but in iMessage and SMS for high school students. And there's something about that form factor that I think, or medium, just allowed it to have viral growth because students would text it during class and other students would see that they were texting it. We heard that they were asking this funny question, like they would send these long messages and other people would think, who are you sending these paragraphs to? And they were like, it's an AI. And then I think that the novelty of the AI chat experience helped a lot. But it was, at that time, the API costs were very high. And so we ended up burning through a lot of our runway just from usage and messages being sent. And also Twilio costs were really expensive for the SMS delivery. So we had growth, but it was really hard to figure out how to monetize that growth.
Yeah. So things are going pretty well, but there are costs that are involved. And I'm assuming that later down the line, after you hit this peak of things going really well, it's when the costs start to pile up and you guys are still struggling to monetize.
Yeah, I mean, we just weren't prepared for that kind of growth. When you were interning, we were really focused on prototyping this experience in Discord. Our costs were incredibly low and we were just learning from this small beta community. And I think I didn't know what it meant to have semi-product market fit. We weren't monetizing, so I don't think it was actual product market fit, but the novelty of that experience just blew up faster than we were expecting.
And could you explain for people who don't know about product market fit, what that is and why that's important to building a tech startup?
Yeah, I mean, this concept, I think it was proposed by Mark Andreessen, but it's basically you're creating a product that aims to solve a certain problem, certain group of people or company. And product market fit is this phenomenon that happens when that product solves that problem well enough that it then like the product takes hold in the market and it starts either growing quickly. What it looks like depends on what sector you're in, but it's basically when the thing starts working.
And did you ever feel like you reached that product?
I think true product market fit comes when you have something that is working both in terms of growth, but also like making money. And it maybe sustainable or like on track to be sustainable, because I think part of the product market fit is the business model. It wasn't clear how we were going to make.
So maybe the growth part you had somewhat figured out, but the business model
Yes,
and
definitely.
making money. And I guess, were there any other factors in addition to this monetization piece that led you to consider shutting down?
Yeah, one of the other pieces of product market fit actually that I should have mentioned is like you have a clear customer that you're serving and you understand that demographic really well, like that initial customer profile, like who is the person that you're serving. And I think one of the problems that we had was that it started with high school students using it for the education use case, which is what we created the company around. We were an ed tech company. But because of the novelty of the experience, a lot of students were using it not for educational purposes. And then it was like, well, this use case is diverging from what we initially had set out to do. And we had adults and like other kinds of, it actually got really popular in the Jewish communities around New York. Something like a quarter of all messages were sent in Hebrew. And they were like pretty Hasidic Jews texting questions about religion, but also just like other questions that we realized were probably coming from flip phones because they can't have smartphones. So it was almost like a way of them accessing like the knowledge of the internet, but through the text interface, which was interesting, but it was like, I didn't want to create a, you know, a rabbi bot. So that was the other trick of the product market fit, was like it was growing, but not necessarily specifically in the demographic that we wanted it to. And it was also just generally the company was diverging from what I started Edgi to do.
Maybe let's talk about that. What did you start it for? And then I know around this point where you're thinking of shutting it down, what did it become?
Yeah, I mean, outset, I've sort of since college have been really interested in our education system generally, but like learning and education. I got kicked out of high school. I went to boarding school and just generally was a bad student. Got into NYU, which was fantastic. The school called Gallatin, where you design your own major. And that was a great experience for me. But I've always just kind of been interested in this idea of like, how do you fix our education system? And more specifically, like how do you get people interested in learning? A lot of people, including myself, leave school with this association that learning is or tiresome. Like you have to do it to get to some other objective. Like you don't really do it because it's enjoyable or fulfilling in and of itself. And I guess I got obsessed with this idea of one of the hardest problems to solve is how do you get teenagers excited about learning? So we started Edgi with this question of, can you get students excited about learning? This was particularly meaningful when we started it, which was right after COVID hit. And so students were like totally disengaged. They weren't doing their homework. They just didn't care about school. Their teachers were overwhelmed. So it felt like an opportunity to explore what does it look like to get students excited about learning about things that they actually care about. And it became at the end, we were just desperate to make something work. And I learned a lot about what it means to solve a burning problem for a user. Like for students, their burning problem is like getting good grades on their exams or getting their homework done super fast. But it's really hard to create a company trying to solve a societal problem. So yeah, and also my co-founders had left and the company just looks very different at the end than when it started. And yeah, it felt time to shut it down.
Yeah. I always wondered about that and never had asked you about people leaving and how that had made you feel, because episode 2 of How I Decided, Ashay Modi on, and he had left and we had discussed that. And I got his perspective about what it was like leaving, knowing that you were part of this team and now they don't have you anymore, how they're going to deal with that. But for you being quite one of the few left, like, how is that for you experiencing your co-founder leaving?
Yeah, I mean, so when I started Edgi, I started with my girlfriend, Tinsley, and then both of us had no idea what we were doing. And so we got introduced to Ashay, who had gone to undergrad at Stern, which is a business school, and had more experience, was older than us and had experience working in tech companies. And it was very comforting, the idea that like someone who actually knew something about startups and business would come on. I think throughout the whole process, And Tinsley actually left first. Tinsley also, it's pretty hard to start a company with your girlfriend. Like the blending, we were also living in our office, like in the office building.
Yes.
So the blending of personal life and work life was hard. So at some point she decided to leave. It also, especially at the end when we were doing the chatbot, we just didn't need all of us. So I experienced having them as co-founders and then both of them deciding to leave and then continuing for 9 months after that. It's tricky. I mean, doing a startup alone is also really hard, like very lonely experience.
So we've talked a little bit about the monetization piece, the co-founders piece. These are all contributing factors to choosing to shut down Edgy. I do want to know for you, because when I think about entrepreneurship and when a lot of people think about entrepreneurship, the theme that comes up a lot is persistence, right? Like not giving up, not quitting, even when things are really difficult. And that's one of the hardest things about being an entrepreneur. So for you, in assessing what's going on in, those last couple of months, how did you know this was something that was maybe different from the challenges you had faced before, or this was something that could be fit and you would want to work on it, or give yourself another 6 months to try it out?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, this is the thing that was the hardest for me because I did and still believe that persistence is the number one factor in success. Like just sort of like a total irrational persistence and willing to go to any lengths to just stay alive, basically, I think is one of the best pieces of advice that you could give founders is just don't give up. So it was really hard for me to struggle with feeling that and also feeling like it wasn't working. And I don't know, I think one of the things that was really helpful for me, just a change in how I thought about it, was shutting the entity down. There was this moment where I realized, what is an entity? I hate to invoke Yuval Noah Harari here, but there's that famous bit in Sapiens where he talks about storytelling as one of these amazing things that humans do. And laws are really just like narratives that we tell. And because we all believe in them, that creates the value and the meaning. And so an entity is really just these magical words written on a piece of paper that everybody agrees upon. It's not the thing itself or like the idea. So one of the things that helped me was that I separated my commitment to the idea of trying to figure out how to get teenagers excited about learning and change people's relationship to learning and education, which I still believe in and I feel is my life's mission. Like I'm very committed to trying to figure that out. And the specific instantiation of the entity that was Edgy at the time, separating those two was huge in helping me evaluate, is this the right entity to accomplish the goal that I ultimately want to accomplish? And what would happen if we were to shut down the entity, but I still be persistent in that sort of life's mission?
It's like this idea that you have this mission of making learning better for teenagers. And at the moment that you were working on Edgy, the way you were fulfilling is that through this entity, the startup that you're working on. And if you thought of it as just one thing, then you would think that shutting down my company, Edgi Learning, is, I guess, like killing my mission. But if you're able to keep those two things separate, you'll be able to say, okay, like maybe my startup won't work out, but I'll still be able to pursue this mission, maybe in a different capacity.
Yeah, I would even go a step further. It was like the risk, what it felt like was killing a part of myself. Because that's really what founders are doing. Like a company, you are putting yourself into the company and you identify with it. It's like a child in a lot of ways. And you don't want to kill your child. It's like a traumatizing experience.
Yeah.
And to have to make that decision is really tough. But separating the idea, recognizing that there's all kinds of learnings and other things, positive things that have come out from trying to do it. But it's not a child. It's not a living, breathing thing that you're killing. And it also doesn't necessarily have to be part of you. Just to say this, one of the things so I did a lot of theater in middle school and high school, and my theater teacher in middle school said this thing to me, which I'll never forget. And he said this during one rehearsal, that the creative act involves killing babies, which is like to create something, you make mistakes all the time, or you create something and then in service of the storyline or like some other objective, sometimes you have to kill things that you really love or you put them aside for later. And that's actually how you get to something that's much better in the end, is like being comfortable with killing babies. So I think that's actually like a really important part of the creative process.
Yeah. Did you feel like that kind of took away from some of the stress of decision, is that kind of idea of a larger purpose in the future, or allow me to do a job?
Yeah, I think so. And I'd also just, felt, I think over time, especially towards the end, I had better clarity around what went wrong, the mistakes that were made, or different ways that we could have approached the problem, or like what the goal was. And I felt good about the shots that we gave. I didn't feel we left something on the table in the version of Edgi that we tried.
You did mention to me, I think when we talked last, that you had this like last minute like Hail Mary attempt. You brought on some extra people. So what was that like? And I guess why didn't that end up working?
So at the very end, I was like, the bot was working, but what I really realized was that I needed a technical co-founder, or at least someone who was not necessarily a co-founder, but someone who would lead the technical aspect. And I could do distribution, but I needed someone to help build the product. And so in the last 6 months, we're like trying to find that person. And yeah, there at the very end, I found some guys who had built an app, and I was like, maybe we'll like combine forces somehow. And we worked together for a few weeks, and I was like, part of it was just a pressure for me to try to keep the thing alive, which was forcing dynamics that could evolve organically. And that I think also helped me realize, if within these constraints, all of this feels forced, like it might just be better to let it go, reflect, and return at some point in a way that's more thoughtful.
Do you think though that other things, let's say you did want to keep this alive, it would also have that same feeling of feeling force? Is that not how it always feels when you're facing pressure, something's not working, like, and make that additional effort to
like will it always feel forced when you're trying to be persistent, basically?
Yeah, I'm just curious.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's also just it's really hard to come up with general rules about this, because it's a lot of it is just what do you feel at the time? And there were so many times before I ultimately decided to shut the company down. We had thought about it, but then decided not to, and decided to keep going. There were like many iterations of that where it felt forced, but actually at every one of those moments, I'm glad that we didn't, because there was so much that we did after that I learned from, that was, informative.
It's hard to come up with like a rubric for, if XYZ happens, we're shutting it down.
Yeah, and to be honest, I think part of what's difficult about it is there's some part of me that still feels conflicted about it. It was incredibly relieving to shut Edgi down, and I think it was the right decision. But another part of me is like, well, it's a much better story if I didn't. And I just kept going and made it work. And there's all kinds of things you can say, like co-founders left, and so there was like the cap table was messed up, or there was like equity that was like, it's just a cleaner start, and that messes up with the narrative of going to VCs. But the truth is, if you have something that's working, none of the other stuff matters. Like, you figure it out. I don't know. I think it was the right decision, but there's still that like question in my mind.
I do think that that feeling that you felt of being relieved almost is an indicator of, okay, like in your heart, the way you feel like this was it should have gotten down, or in that sense, like the post-decision relief, or maybe for some people like anxiety, if they feel like, oh shit, like I shouldn't have done that sort of thing. I do want to talk to you about a few things, I guess, startup related. I think first, stakeholders. So what did your investors have to say about this? The people that are giving you money for your startup that you're now shutting down, and yeah, we'll get to students and the people that, and your users after, but let's start with investors.
I mean, it was mixed, understandably. I think some of them were incredibly supportive. I mean, yeah. And I was very grateful to those people. And a lot of them continue to be supportive. Like, they're constantly texting me, like, when are you going to start your next thing? And I'm so excited to back you again. That's the best. There are others who are like, dude, what happens? Why? No, don't.
What are you
just
doing?
keep going. Just figure it out. And it was really hard. I mean, a lot of them I really respected and were great investors and gave a lot of good advice. And it was hard to feel like I had let them down and disappointed them.
And now let's talk about the students, our user base. How was that communicated to them?
Yeah, I mean, the students are really interesting because when we had the Discord community, as you'll remember, that we had this small group of incredibly engaged students. We had basically every founder would dream to have, which is the group of couple hundred students were really engaged and loved everything that we were doing. Would spend all of their time on the Discord server, would have conversations with us. It's classic YC advice of do things that don't scale.
Mm-hmm.
It ended up being tricky, and I actually think you get part of the concern with that was that they were doing it because they like spending time with us and not necessarily because the product in itself was like really compelling for them. It was also tricky when you're doing like a community-based thing. But I think one of the things that was helpful was that at the end, when the product started scaling on iMessage and SMS, it became less interpersonal with the students, which actually was another thing that I was bummed about. But I was spending much less time with students individually. And so it was a gradual phase out of that. By the time we were shutting it down, I think they were sad, but it had evolved into something else than the thing that they personally really loved. But the users that we were ended up serving with the bot, like they were mad for maybe a day, like, where is this going? But we'd also just tried to charge them for it, which they were also not happy about.
Yeah.
And they were like, ChatGPT was free. I think we actually directed all of them to Pi, who you could text. It was from Inflection that just was scooped up by Microsoft, basically.
Oh,
we
recommended.
Yeah, we were like, go text this. They have $1 billion and their thing is free. And we can't support that, but they have a texting service. So just send them somewhere else.
Okay. And what's the process like for shutting down a startup? I'm not sure. I'm not really even too familiar with that. Is that a lot of legal stuff? Was it like a hassle to put together?
Not really. And it costs, I don't know, $1,500 or something like that for them to get all the paperwork together. You file a dissolution thing with accountants to make sure that you're filing your taxes properly. The biggest thing, though, like outside of the technicals of shutting a company down, was something that I'm very glad that I did, which was write a last supporter update. Like I was writing monthly supporter updates. And at the end, I wrote final update. Obviously, I told our investors before then that we were shutting down, but that last update was just telling that we were shutting down. And it gave me a chance to reflect on what were the biggest learnings. Why am I doing this? Like what was the rationale for shutting down? And just like giving that general reflection. And that, I think it resonated with a lot of people, and VCs were even like forwarding it to other founders that they had supported. And I think like the network that created for me was really helpful, but also it was just a general, it was a mourning process, which was good.
Yeah, I know, because I remember reading that, and it was like, it was almost because of you like reflecting on it and what you had learned, it was like made it more optimistic. Actually, it was like, even though Edgi was shutting down, like it felt like there was a ton that you had taken away from it. I think that's what like really resonated with people, is that even in objective failure, it's also there's something that we can take away from it.
That actually I think is really important. That psychologically, being able to separate shutting the company down from like killing a part of myself was really important for being able to write that final update, because I think it's very easy to fall into the trap of feeling so guilty and ashamed or like bad about failing that you can't actually take a step back and reflect on the experience, because you're sort of like psychologically defensive about accepting that this is something that's happening. And so I think creating that distance is actually really helpful for doing that reflection and just forgiving yourself. It's generally a good thing.
It's a good thing to do, yeah. Were you experiencing any of those emotions, say guilt or fear or shame, that, and this is something I haven't talked to any entrepreneur about, is this idea of being viewed by your peers or your family or others as, oh, like that guy who started a company, but it didn't work out, that sort of thing. Is that something that has crossed your mind at all or impacted?
I mean, even just talking about this, like those feelings are coming back up for me about disappointing my investors and it being a really hard decision. And people say the stat of 90% of startups fail, but it's the norm. Good investors know that's built into their math. And generally people that I've encountered think it's cool that you tried. Like you took the risk and tried to create something. You've obviously learned a lot. It's definitely been helpful, I've had the chance to work at some Series A startups after shutting Edgi down. The founder experience is really important to them, and I think it looks really good when you're applying to jobs. So I think generally it's more, in most cases, I'd say that you're probably harder on yourself about it than like anyone else is critical of you for having failed.
Absolutely. I always think about it in terms of tennis terms because that's just the way I think these days. But it's you lose a big match and you're like, nah, fuck, like I suck. Like everything I did was like a waste. But then if you give yourself the space to step back, you see like all the work that you've done, and it's not necessarily reflected. This one thing, this one match isn't reflective.
Yeah. And if anyone's looking at you like, oh, dude, you failed, you lost to that person, you're so bad
You're a
at tennis,
loser.
it's way more about them than it is about you. They clearly they're projecting something on you about what they wish for themselves.
And there's always the next match,
Yeah,
next
exactly.
venture,
Yeah.
thing that you're doing.
Totally.
I do have one final question for you, which is that I continue to read a lot about decision making or hear what other people have to say about the science and stuff. And research has actually said that for quitting, or I'm just going to bucket that with quitting or shutting down a startup, that we quit way too late, past the point that we should have already done it. Did you feel like that was the case for you?
It's tough. I mean, in some ways, yes, could have made the decision to shut the company down far earlier. Like even just that, imagining that hypothetical, there were so many things that I learned at the end that were like, if I decided to shut Edgi down when Ashe and Tinsley both decided to leave, growth actually came shortly after that. And then experiencing what it was like to try to work quickly to meet the demand that was being generated, and learning about how, when things are working, like what that feels like and looks like, even though if under the surface they weren't actually working in the way that we needed them to. Like, that's an invaluable experience. So it's tough. Also, who knows if I hadn't shut it down and kept going, whether I'd say the same thing.
Yeah. And hearing you talk about it, I'm now actually curious of looking further into that research, how they even knew that. People even said, oh, it was like too late, because looking back, there's like hindsight bias, but
yeah, totally.
And also it's just really, you have no idea. But I think what is like concrete and we do know is that in the additional time that you spent on it, there's stuff that you gained from it. It started doing much better, and that's learning experience for you going forward.
Yeah, there's this always, I mean, it's always like post the thing, it's really easy to just create narratives about what could it have been if we hadn't shut it down, or what might we have learned what doors would have been opened if I had shut it down earlier, and what would that have looked like, and maybe I would have learned more in that case. There's a way of knowing.
So you don't think that's useful to?
I think that the thing that's important is not to be sappy, but like the forgiving yourself, like not having the decision, whatever decision you're making, so tied to your personal identity. In particular, when thinking about the success or failure of a startup, I don't know, even when I'm saying that, like having it tied to your personal identity is actually really helpful as a motivating force to grind it out.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
I don't know. It's really hard to generalize these things, but I do giving yourself space. I'll just say what was really helpful for me was deciding that the entity wasn't the thing that I needed to preserve at all costs. What hasn't died in me is my passion and excitement and interest in trying to figure out how to make education better and people more excited about learning. And preserving that, I think, was the thing that's most important for me.
I think that's a great way to wrap it up. Thank you so much. And this is a great space as well.
Welcome to host here anytime.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode with Josh Shapiro. My main takeaway from my conversation with Josh is that the key to quitting or shutting down your project or company at the right moment is to realize that your personal mission and identity is separate from the thing that you're actually quitting on. If you do quit or give up, you are still the same person with the same goals. And also through the process of working on your project, you've learned a lot that can help you with whatever you decide to do in the future. There are also a lot of strong emotions associated with quitting that can prevent us from wanting to step back and reflect upon what we've learned. I think a great exercise that Josh and I talked about to deal with this is to do something similar to what Josh did, which was write a final reflection about a startup and what he had learned in the process of shutting it down. Let me know who I should have next on the How I Decided podcast, and thank you for listening again.